Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Middle East Institute panel. I'm so glad you're able to join us on such a timely issue. We'll be talking about a very interesting paper that came out earlier this month called A Strategy for Countering the Houthi Threat at Sea. As many of our listeners know, that there have been a series of attacks in the Red Sea by Houthis targeting commercial and military ships in what they say is in response to the U.S. war in Gaza. And we have a great panel to talk about the issues around this, and I'm eager to hear their thoughts. So we're going to jump right into it, and I'll invite you to read their panels online. Kevin, Bilal, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to start by helping our viewers learn a little bit about what led you to write this paper in which you put forth that the U.S. should consider more interdiction when it comes to dealing with the threat from Houthis. It's interesting that you put this paper out right around the time that the U.S. just was doing an interdiction mission using a Coast Guard cutter we learned earlier today from U.S. Central Command. So I'd love if you could help us get a sense of what led to the paper that you wrote at the time that you did it. How did it come about?
Excellent. Why don't I just kick it off and then happy to pass it over to Kevin. Nancy, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. I know you have a very, very tight schedule. Also, I want to mention that Kevin and I are co-authors, but we also have three other authors in the memo, so I want to recognize them. But we are responsible for our own words today. It doesn't necessarily mean that they also agree with what we're going to say today. And I know that you're going to ask about different subjects, not just the memo. So I just wanted to say that it was a wonderful collaborative effort. Let me just very briefly say that obviously it all has to start with interest, right? And we just felt, all of us, that a core interest of the United States in the Middle East is now really at risk. And this is an interest on which many American presidents, all the way from Jimmy Carter to this very day, have based actually U.S. Middle East policy on. So we felt there was some kind of an urgency to address it. And we saw a potential trajectory of this crisis that wasn't very reassuring. So raising awareness about it, try to come up with some kind of an idea in order to address it, was really what led us to write this memo. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, just to be add to what Bilal said and be brief at the same time. The other thing that was in the forefront was, there's a lot of folks that are tying that the end of the war in Gaza, it would mean the end of this. And we're realists. The authors in that paper are realists. When this war ends, if the Houthis still have this capability to reach out into the Red Sea, the pretext of ending the conflict in Gaza, it could be something else that they'd come up with. And now we have a terrorist group that basically sits on the corner of one of the critical choke points in the world, with the capability to choke it off and hold hostage the internet, the flow of commerce. And so it's not just related to what we're seeing in Gaza is the main point. This will linger afterwards if they retain the capability, a terrorist group retains the capability to hold hostage the global supply chain.
I want to invite our viewers to submit their questions, but I'll take my moderator's privilege and ask a few to start us off. One of the challenges that we have seen in terms of assessing the success of the current U.S. strike campaign against the Houthis is that we don't have a tangible measure of success. That is, we've seen at least three major offensive campaigns by the United States, a series of what they have described as self-defense measures, but we haven't seen a market change in the tempo of strikes on commercial ships. And as you note in the paper, the current strategy that you're putting forth there's no guarantee that it works. And so I wonder if you could help us understand or figure out a metric to determine whether interdiction, as you propose it, is working. Should the U.S. implement it? Is there a way that we can measure, for example, a certain number of ships that are able to pass through, a certain number of ships that are interdicted? In your strategy, do you have a way to give policymakers a metric of success?
Let me defer to the former Fifth Fleet Commander first, and then I'll follow his lead. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, Nancy, that question is one we'd all like to have a simple answer to, right? I mean, the first thing that happened when the first set of strikes went down is the next day there was an attack, or that evening actually, and it was relatively large one, right, that happened. Oh, look, the tax had no impact. Well, because there's never going to be a direct correlation uh, to you do one thing and then that eliminates that complete capacity of something as complex as the Houthis' ability to reach into the Red Sea, right? It's not all coalesced in one place, and you can go in and just end that capability. Instead, we do, from a military standpoint, track capability in a bunch of different ways. But I caution that those kinds of metrics often become drivers that aren't really painting the picture, right? So there's a couple of things we would want to, when we look at this, we would want to look at the whole network. How are the Houthis able to attack, right? And can we degrade that? And also, how are they able to get resupplied? So if we can then start to atrophy their capability, they can't build it back up again. And so this would be, what we're advocating for is to finally develop a realistic approach to cutting off and interdicting this supply chain that's coming from Iran. Another piece is getting the Iranians to agree to stop. And as you know, there's been even pressure from the Chinese to ask them to stop doing this. And again, because of the same reasons that, so I don't know that we'll ever have that single metric that we can say. Clearly, the one we'd all like to see is that, one, the attacks have diminished enough so that the key shipping companies are now using the Red Sea to transit and not having to go around Africa and causing the 10 additional delays each way and $1.5 million in costs each way and the delays associated with that. So that's the metric that I would hope would be the end state, is that the Red Sea and the transit through to the Suez Canal, north to south and south to north, gets back closer to normal.
Yeah, that's very well said. Nancy, I'll just add very, very quickly. Obviously, the whole exercise of, battle damage assessment, which the U.S. military does every time there's a strike against an adversary, is always challenging. It really depends on what you really are measuring and what is the objective of that assessment, which obviously has to be done very independently from the strike unit that goes after the target. And I think in here, the priority is going to be the more lethal weaponry that are in the possession of the Houthis. And that includes, of course, the ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, and to some extent, at least, the drones, even though it's going to be more difficult because those are cheaper and those are easier to access. But when you're talking about ballistic missiles, I mean, the first time in the history of the region, a non-state actor is actually shooting ballistic missiles and cruise missiles against commercial shipping. We didn't even see that, obviously, during the 1980s when we had to deal with several threats from the Iranians at the time. That has to be the priority. That has to be the priority. And there are certain ways to assess that. And I very much echo what Kevin said about the, measurable degradation of those capabilities. But it's always going to be challenging. Absolutely.
So what's interesting is one metric of success, which I thought was very helpful, was if those ships are able to pass through with some regularity. That hasn't happened since the U.S. strike campaign began. Can you give us a sort of general sense? Do you assess then that the strategy is working, not working, needs more time?
Yeah, so well, first, it's my great hope that one of the things that progresses is that this continues to become more of a coalition of effort than, hey, what is the U.S. doing? And there's lots of reasons we can get into that in a second. So I want to emphasize that, in our paper, but also in the discussions we've had all around this, is we're not advocating that the U.S. go in and eliminate the threat to the Houthis. That's not at all what we're advocating for. But your real question going to, hey, it's not working, I think it has been working. To be frank, when you look at the complexity and the magnitude of the attacks that they were making initially, we've seen that not be as robust. There's more time between events, and the events tend to be more singular, meaning there is an impact to some extent on their capability to do this. Remember, it's difficult to just wait, and if you're limited to only trying to degrade this mechanical capability, then you're going to have a limited impact on eliminating it or even making it less effective. What I'm saying is, right now the U.S.'s approach is to be going after the things, and particularly ones that they can tie, directly to the event, because rightly, they don't want collateral damage, and I think they've been successful at not having collateral damage, and 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 we are hoping that time is on the side. In other words, that we can start to build this pressure outside the lines of the military actions that also can have an impact. That's why I mentioned even China telling the Iranians to stop. That's positive. How do we build that out? How do we build out other nations coming to do the same thing? Because the global supply chain and the free flow of commerce that's at risk is not a U.S. problem. To be frank, the impacts in the U.S. Are substantial for a lot of reasons that I could talk about right now. They may over time become greater, but it's the impoverished nations that are getting hurt the most, and specifically, European nations and some of the manufacturing that's companies in Europe.
So I find that really helpful because I think it's such a clear description of how people can look at the strike so far, measures of success. So thank you for that. I want to ask you both, why would the U.S. effort to interdict work this time? This is something that's been tried in the past, and it's a risky one. We saw last month the death of 2 Navy SEALs trying to do a similar mission. Can you help our viewers understand what makes this approach different than past efforts to get at this problem through interdiction?
Yes. So we have always attempted, with the assets and resources available in the region, to the commanders in the region, to interdict the flow of weapons to Yemen, to the Houthis in Yemen. So I want to be clear about that, because remember, the Houthis are not the legitimate government of Yemen. They overthrew the legitimate government of Yemen. We redesignated them a terrorist group recently. But the UN Security Council has made a resolution back in the day called 2216, which says that all nations are supposed to do what they can to ensure that weapons do not get to the Houthis in Yemen. So, and over time, when there's been interdiction of weapons going to Yemen, the UN has another group called the Council of Experts that goes in to determine where those weapons came from. And each time they determined the origin of the weapons was Iran. So this isn't the US, or anyone else looking and saying, oh, it's Iran, and we don't really know. This is the United Nations going in and looking at the weapons and then identifying where they came from, independent. But your question is, why hasn't it been as effective before? It's because we generally use the resources that happen to be in the area. We didn't resource this as a mission. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, in the past, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was a huge threat to our nation, right? And it's where the bad guys built the things that were difficult to detect by airport sensors that were used that they moved to try to use to attack the West, and specifically even the United States. And the United States at that time decided that we were going to resource an effort to degrade and eliminate the capability of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and specifically in Yemen, from doing that. And we were successful. So I have no doubt it took time, and it didn't happen overnight. And it goes to your question, Nancy, about the metrics piece. No one's arguing that this is a quick win. No one at all is arguing that this is a quick win. But in the end, when Gaza is whatever ended, leaving a terrorist group with the capability to interdict to attack free flow commerce is not optimum. Somehow we have to get at this problem by getting those weapons out of their hands and eliminating their capability to resupply.
Yeah, it's a resourcing issue more than anything else, Nancy. And the moment you adequately, pursue an effective resourcing effort, this is where your chances of effectiveness dramatically increase. We were more ad hoc in the past, to be candid. Not that NAFCENT didn't have task forces designed to actually interdict these things, but it's all about how you prioritize it. And how do you communicate that mission also to partners who are going to be incredibly important to actually contribute to that mission? And this is why this requires, which we haven't done in the past, this is why it's new in this strategy, this requires an interagency effort. So fancy words for the State Department and Defense Department actually having to work together in order to not only communicate the mission to US entities, but also to partners. And so when you prioritize something like this, You need to go and actually recruit partners to actually contribute to this mission. And we obviously haven't done that in the past. I suspect that this is going to be an increasing challenge nowadays because the partners are in a very different position, right? In the past, they were being, attacked by the Houthis, drones and attacks, as you remember very well, Nancy, in previous years. But nowadays, I mean, for them, the war in Yemen is over, right? They want to put it in the past, in the back, and so to go to them with the proposition that we need your support, be it kinetic, be it intelligence, it's going to be a challenging proposition. And you saw the breaking news not too long ago about some of these countries actually wishing to constrain our military activities in the region because they're very much vulnerable. And they're worried about any kind of U.S. kinetic activity against the Houthis might actually backfire and they might become a target of these attacks. So that's why it's different about it. It's a resourcing issue, it's an interagency issue, but it's also much more aggressive international effort as opposed to just a U.S. effort to get this right. That's what's so different about it this time around.
But
Yeah.
it's not unachievable, Nancy. We
Yeah.
we can do hard, well, but we have to have a concerted will to do that, though.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Bilal was talking about a piece earlier in Politico that talked about how some nations are not allowing strikes to happen from their country. They noted the UAE because of some of the political concerns, which I think is such a great point to raise in terms of the political pressure in the region. You talk about more resources. I wonder what the political feasibility of that is here stateside. The US has a lot of ships and subs and other naval resources in the region right now because of the war in Gaza. It has a lot of assets protecting US troops in Iraq, Syria, and throughout the Middle East. Do you think it's politically feasible and domestically for a US audience? And is that one reason the administration might not adopt the idea? Or are there others that are worth talking about in terms of the challenges politically in an election year?
Politically, I don't think it should be an issue. I don't think the American people track as closely how many ships we're using in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden or any other part of the world, frankly. And for the president, it should also not be a heavy lift. It's much more of an issue actually for the U.S. military and the Department of Defense overall. I mean, this is where the food fight happens, and this is where you have to balance between new global priorities, as you said yourself, Nancy, that are focused on the Indo-Pacific and the European theaters, but also having to deal with a very urgent threat. And we could chew gum and walk. I mean, it's like something we haven't done before. So you got to prioritize this simply because it's much more urgent, and it's not really such a challenging proposition for us to make, but it has to start with the commander in chief. Absolutely. I don't think the politics are as challenging as they are, but it's much more of a resource issue where you have to sort of coordinate between, different combatant commands and, of course, within the broader U.S. defense establishment. But it could be done. It could be done. Am I right, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. First, when we say resourcing, we're not talking about carrier strike groups and the big muscle movements that you tend to see. We're talking about the right intelligence and surveillance assets in the AR, the right units that do this well. And we're talking about a level of effort of interagency support of that's prioritized, because there's a lot of things go on that the United States has to monitor and understand deeply. And so, but I think we have a limited and finite time to get after this, Nancy, because the shock absorbers that we have related to prices and oil and all that aren't crunched down yet. Time is going to slowly crunch that shock absorber down to where it doesn't exist anymore. And there's lots of reasons for it, a glut in oil, excess shipping capacity right now, and things like that. They're just really keeping the impact in the United States from being felt in the short term. But in the longer term, we're going to start to feel it. And we don't want to make it at that time an emergency. If we think about this now, we can proactively get at this problem that's coming, because it's not going to end just, our main point is we don't expect this to end just, be great if it ended just when the Gaza war ended, but we're left in a precarious position.
Yeah.
Something I hear from readers when I write about this topic is they don't quite understand why the US has to be in such an assertive position on this. They would argue, for example, this is an issue that affects Europe more than it affects the United States. Chinese ships are allowed to pass through. The strategy is putting US troops in harm's way. And as you noted earlier, there's at least some impact on the strikes so far. So I wonder if you could address those concerns, that what the risk of sort of intervening more in something that right now doesn't feel like a predominant US problem. Does this require more engagement by allies, for example? I ask it because it's an issue that keeps coming up with readers, and I think it speaks to how they see these attacks impacting their bottom line.
Let me keep lobbing the difficult questions to Kevin, and then free ride as many partner nations do in that part of the world.
Yeah. Just let me make sure I understand your question clearly, Nancy. Is the question related to should the U.S. be involved because right now we're not seeing the impact?
I think the question that we're hearing from readers is, why do we have to do this as assertively as we're doing it? We're not seeing an impact on our bottom line.
Yes.
It's affecting Europe, but it's not really affecting us, and yet we're the lead resource on this. And it's something where US troops are in harm's way. We're seeing destroyers see missiles shot over their heads and fears of a US vessel being damaged.
Sure. And but there was also a comment in there about other vessels that are free to pass. So I want to address that one first and then the other. And I'd say that the Houthis aren't sophisticated enough to let one vessel pass over enough. There's lots of reasons for that. Targeting into a complex flow of shipping traffic with the type of weapons they use makes that almost next to impossible. Be very difficult for us. I can't imagine the Houthis being successful for it and having the intelligence to even be able to do it. Maybe initially they had some capability because people turned their identification systems on when they were driving through there. Some think if you turn on that you're Chinese, you won't get attacked, for example. But obviously that isn't the case, or the Chinese wouldn't have asked Iran to help stop this.
Yeah.
In terms of us, I think it goes back to that shock absorber thing that I told you before. Yes, we're not seeing it right now, but it's only because if you go back in time and look at what happened when the motor vessel Ever Given got sideways in the Suez Canal, there was a lot of other things that also happened at the same time that came in waves. COVID, that happened. The war in Ukraine happened. Shanghai port shut down. A lot of pressures came into the global supply chain in waves that eventually really made an impact on the United States and still are felt to this day. But we're in a different situation now because there's a glut in oil. Oil prices are low right now. There's a significant increase in shipping, and shipping companies made early decisions to divert. And so all of those things allowed us to have the privilege of not having it impact us at this moment. If this grinds on, which is likely to grind on, that won't last forever. And we don't want to certainly trip the United States into a recession. And you don't want to add that complexity. Well, the quickest way you can add complexity is mess with the flow and supply of goods around the world, the global supply chain, and energy. And so we all know where that's going to end up. The question is, how much time do we have to deal with the problem?
Yep. I mean, would you rather deal with the crisis before it escalates or actually as it escalates? Because if you're going to deal with it later on, the resources that you're worried about now that you're going to bring to bear are going to be even twice, if not 3 times more, when this thing actually really escalates. Right now, the Federal Reserve is not that worried about inflation, fair enough. But if this thing escalates and it really starts, affecting other choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, for example, then it becomes a political issue for the president, obviously. Because the last thing he wants is for the economy to go back to, a state of inflation that would affect the livelihoods of the American citizens. So I would, and it goes back to a comment that we talked about before. This is more of a preventive strategy, right? So that we can have to deal with it now more calmly with an adequate amount of resources, because once it does escalate, then it's a completely different ballgame, right? And we don't want to get to that. The whole thing is purely defensive in nature. The one actor that's actually escalated is the other side. It's not us, right? And it just so happens to be that the United States is the only country that actually has the capabilities to deal with this, right? It's not like that the Europeans don't want to be involved. Obviously, there's an element of free riding there that we've witnessed for over many years, but it's also an issue of capability. Nobody can do this better than we do, right? And so it's a responsibility, but it's also an issue of capability as well.
That's from the standpoint of actually participating in some of the acts. but not in participating in the other diplomatic and other efforts that I talked about. There
Precisely.
a lot of pressure that can be brought to bear on the supply chain of how the Houthis are getting their things. And they're not just getting them, they still go to the open market for some of the things that they're subverting Security Council resolutions to get some of the parts they need. And as you saw in the interdiction that CENTCOM just made public, they're still getting a bunch of it direct, the key components, these guidance units, these warheads, these things like that that can't be built in Yemen, can't be got on the free market. We see exactly that they're still coming.
Yeah, right now, supply is not an issue, Nancy. The issue is not supply. The issue is more about delays, right? But we also are making an assumption here that if this thing does escalate, that the Saudis would actually produce and increase their output. Can you actually make that assumption? Because we saw a couple of years ago that they didn't, right? The administration was very clear in its communication to the Saudis that, look, you need to do this because it's going to really impact the U.S. economy. The president of the United States at the time, President Biden, personally engaged in diplomacy with the Saudis. And the Saudis says, yeah, sure, we'll think about it. And they never did, right? So that assumption should not be also taken nowadays. Just because the Saudis can do it, it doesn't mean that they will. As a matter of fact, they've been trying to increase the price of oil over the past few months or so, but there's just so much supply that it's not actually, it's outpacing the demand.
I think one other key question is whether you believe that the Houthis will stop these attacks if there's a ceasefire reached in Gaza. Because I think those who believe that think that there's no need for these sort of increased possible tensions with an Iranian-backed group. You guys have made reference to why you don't think that's going to happen. And we've heard that there is some concern that the Houthis are using these strikes to distract from their own political and economic failings within Yemen, where famine and other food security issues are prevalent. They did stop during the first ceasefire, the only ceasefire we've seen so far. I wonder if you could help us understand why you believe that they won't stop if there's a ceasefire. Will the dynamics in the region allow them to continue doing these strikes if there is, in fact, a sustained ceasefire?
Do you want me to take this, Kevin, or do you want to start?
Okay, so first, I've watched the Houthis operate for a long time, so that's number one. And there's no. I take the other view. There's no reason to believe they would stop. They may pause and then come up with a different approach. What the Houthis are struggling right now with is a poor ability to govern in Yemen. Right, it's always easy to do a rebellion, then you're handed with the governments. And Yemen has tremendous problems: famine, of unemployment, of water supply, water shortages, and the rest. And right now, this particular thing that they're doing is popular because it's very sympathetic. The general Yemeni population is very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and in their mind, and the suppression of the Palestinians beyond just the conflict that's going on in Gaza. If the conflict were over tomorrow, how does that necessarily change in the average mind of the Yemeni that the Palestinians are no longer oppressed, right? I think the real issue comes with that they are still left with the capability and capacity to interdict international shipping in the global supply chain, and they have shown quite clearly the will to use that if they have some view that they want to make a point of. In this case, they said they would attack only things that are supporting the Israelis. Well, that's not the case. To be frank, most of the things that they've attacked had nothing to do with the war in Gaza because they're not discriminate enough to do that. And instead, it's just resulted in what I mentioned before, which is a rerouting of the entire supply chain of the world around Africa, which we're able to accept a little bit now with increased costs, increased time and delays to getting some things, and increased impact on the economy that's only going to get worse over time. So to me, the Houthis have everything you don't want a terrorist organization to have. They have the means and capacity. They've shown the will to use it, and they're not a nation state that we can go have a discussion with and come to some agreement that they won't do it again and in any way be able to trust them. Bilal?
Yeah, I mean, as the US government, the last thing I want to do is actually establish a connection between the grievance of the Houthis and its effect on actually what we're going to do in terms of diplomacy in Gaza. That's the last thing I want to do, right? Because today it could be a grievance on the Palestinians, tomorrow it could be something completely different, right? So the last thing I want to do is show that this tactic actually works. That said, nobody's arguing against a more reinvigorated approach to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That has its own reasons. In its own right, it's incredibly important. Whether it has an effect on Yemen, that's a completely secondary and if not irrelevant issue. Those attacks happened before October 7. You got to remember that. Fair enough, not in the same frequency, not in the same intensity, but those attacks were happening way before this whole thing started in Gaza, right? And so the last thing we want is now we just designated them as a terrorist organization, having the capacity to once again hold hostage global commerce whenever they want because of perceived, imaginary, or real or legitimate grievances. Um, and so, yes, of course, we would love to test the proposition that if we were to achieve some kind of political progress in Gaza, that would stop the attacks as far as the Houthis are concerned. But we just have our doubts. The Houthis have their own local interests. Yes, cement their political control in northern Yemen. They have adversaries in Yemen still that they want to compete with. And that's the best way to show that they are now the number one partner of the Iranians, that they are the go-to now proxy. And all of these local calculi have nothing to do with Gaza. Nothing to do with Gaza.
So, Bilal, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you see is a potential pause in the event of a ceasefire, but then the use of any sort of conflict in the region to resume these kinds of attacks. Is that a fair summation?
I welcome a pause, but it's insufficient. Even in the most ideal scenario where you actually see a pause, they still have the capacity. And because they have exercised that capacity, they've actually launched strikes. That means that they could do it again whenever they feel like it. Of course, in coordination with the Iranians and inconsistent with Iranian efforts in the region to achieve regional primacy and to drive the Americans out of the region.
So this seems like a good point to talk about Iran. One of the things we've heard from the Biden administration is that they haven't been more aggressive, in part because they fear escalation with Iran, especially as we're seeing this week clashes along the Lebanese border. We've seen strikes against U.S. troops in Iraq, Syria, and across the Middle East by Iranian-backed proxies. I wonder if you could help us understand sort of, or at least address that potential risk of escalation that happens with something like interdiction. How do you mitigate against that potential risk?
That's the fear that people have that when you're talking about Iran, that, oh my gosh, we can drive them to do something, that could lead to a road to war with Iran. And then you hear many people say that neither the U.S. publicly has said this, but that we don't want to go to war with Iran, and the Iranians don't necessarily, if you look at where they sit, want to be at war with the United States right now. But I don't see that risk as being real. Quite frankly, I think the Iranians are surprised, and it's not just because of the Houthi thing, but that they've been able to attack over 150 times U.S. Troops on the ground in Iraq and Syria. And it was only when and the U.S. was forced to defend, and it was only fortunate that we didn't have soldiers seriously injured and killed. And then all of a sudden we had 3 killed in Jordan, and that's when we acted. This idea that you can continue to defend against something like that is the problem, and to the Iranians it looks like a weakness, and so we have taken out the leader of the Quds force in Iraq back several years ago, and that didn't lead to war, and there's lots of reasons for that, and I don't expect the interdiction efforts to lead to war either, because Iran will say that's not us that loaded those ships up or whatever. They're trying to keep their arms distance away. I also believe we have to address this directly with the Iranians, not we, but the international community, that the malign activities that they have. But what we argued for in our paper is those are all legitimate concerns. Let's not take on everything at once. Let's solve the one that's the clear and present danger and that could have the greatest direct impact to us and is the core U.S. national interest, which is free flow of commerce. So that's why we're not saying those other problems don't have to be solved, but they do. And I don't believe that escalation is a reason for us not to take this action, because in the past, when we've been firm and hard against Iran, and you can go all the way back to when our troops were trying to leave Iraq and we were getting attacked with IRAMs and explosively formed penetrators, and we went very hard and not only told Iran through emissaries to stop, but what the ramifications would be, and we took some significant actions. We were able to deter Iran from doing further attacks. So I don't believe Iran's undeterrable, and I don't believe this is a road to war by doing interdiction of what they claim they're not doing anyway.
Bilal?
One of the most fascinating and dangerous episodes of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we had multiple options at the time to respond to the introduction of surface-to-surface ballistic missiles that were nuclear tipped. Not a single one of these options was certain or risk-free, but we ended up going to the blockade, if you remember, right? This is similar. And ended up being actually pretty effective at the time. An interdiction regime is purely defensive. It is on that matrix, if you want to come up with a matrix or a Venn diagram, the least escalatory and perhaps the most effective. Now, if we're going to go after the Houthis inside Yemen and perhaps start really upping military assistance to local resistance agents or anybody who has a problem with the Yemenis or with the Houthis, then maybe that's a little bit more escalatory than what we're calling for. But we are actually trying to uphold international law. I mean, there are resolutions, United Nations Security Council resolutions that actually prohibit the Houthis from using lethal means to advance their objectives and to cement their control. This, on that list of concerns about the risk of escalation, this should be the least escalatory and the most legal, most legitimate.
Before I hand off to our questions from our viewers, because they've asked so many great ones, I wonder if you could help us understand how you see the link between Iranian-backed militia attacks in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and other parts of the Middle East to what's happening in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Is there a connector thread as you see it? And if so, what is it?
To me, the connective thread is Iran, of course, but they are distinctly different. And the only reason I say that they're distinctly different, not if you're Iran, you see it as another one of the tentacles of the ways that you can influence, but they're different in the mechanisms in that the Houthis, were an entity long before Iran started to give them as much support as they've had before. They are not necessarily a Quds force operative of Yemen. Does that make sense? In other words, they're not following, they're not in that direct, I would say the Iranians can't say, do exactly this, and then they do it. Instead, this is more along the lines where they can arm them, and the Houthis have common cause with Yemen, and will use those weapons and capabilities in a way that probably the Iranians are happy that they're using them to do, right? And Iran can claim it's not them. So when you look at the militia in Iraq and Syria, I think those ties and ability for the Iranians to control them more directly exist to a far greater extent. That's why I say they're a little bit separate, and this group isn't like Hezbollah either for the similar reasons. Could it be over time? Potentially, but probably not, because of how the Houthis were born locally and how they particularly govern themselves internally. That's my thoughts. Bilal?
Perfect opportunity for the Iranians to showcase the capabilities of this proxy network. You know, for a long time, we were talking about it on paper, like theoretically. Look at all these proxies that are working for the Iranians, that are loyal to the Iranians. Now you're actually seeing it in live action. And all of it in the service of Iranian strategic goals, including driving the Americans out of the Middle East. I promise you, it's going to be probably 6 months to a year where you're going to have a much more heated debate about the U.S. presence in Syria and about the U.S. presence in Iraq. That's all part of this campaign by the Iranians, which you got to give them credit, give the devil's due, to drive us out of the region, at least in terms of U.S. military presence, and to try to achieve regional primacy. This is the connecting thread. And yes, different local contexts for each and every single one of them, but all of them are very much consistent with what the Iranians are trying to do.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things we've heard from the U.S. military is that there's real concern that the strikes in Iraq won't stop. Even if there's a ceasefire, there's a little bit more mixed debate about whether they stop in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So it's interesting that you make that link, that the intent is in both places is the same, and sort of bolsters the argument, as you see it, if I'm hearing you correctly, about why they won't stop even in the event of the ceasefire, because it gets in the way of that ultimate goal of driving the U.S. presence out of the region.
And Nancy, Iran is perfectly capable of playing the role of a firefighter, but also an arsonist, right? They love it when we go to them directly, indirectly, and say, hey, we need your help stopping the attacks of X, Y, and Z. And then, of course, that enhances their bargaining power on a bunch of issues, right? This is why this is so annoying, frustrating, and strategic for them, because they have so many toys, so many tools, so many actors to play with that could really advance their interests on a multiple, levels and in different arenas, right? They have leverage with the Houthis, with the Iraqi militias, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with all of this. Imagine every time we have to solve any of these problems, you have to go to the Iranians and provide them with a concession. That's a great position to be in.
One question that came up from one of our viewers is, and it's something I hear about all the time, is the spy ship that's operating in the region, and whether that's a legitimate target, if that risks escalation. I was wondering if you could address the presence of that Iranian spy ship and how it's providing intel, and what are sort of some of the options to limit its capability vis-a-vis these strikes by the Houthis.
Well, first I'll start off by saying I'm not privy to the latest intelligence on exactly what the ship's doing, but maybe I can, for the viewers, talk a little bit about what the ship is, its history a little bit, and then what I think that it's contributing. So the Iranians, for as long as I can remember, have had a ship that's basically sat at anchor in the middle of the Red Sea to provide and understand intelligence for lots of reasons. For one, it was one of the lines of supply that the Iranians would use to get weapons to Hezbollah back in the day, right? Weapons would flow by sea around and up through the Gulf, maybe potentially in across Egypt or up that way, potentially into the Mediterranean, and then around into Hezbollah. Sounds like a roundabout way, but if you remember, they didn't have a direct land route to go through Iraq in Syria, because Syria was, since the war in Syria and the war in Iraq, they've established a path to the north now to be able to better and more directly resupply Hezbollah. So they've always had a ship there to understand that environment, to help them with that. When the war in Yemen began, where the Houthis had their uprising against it, it was clear to me that the Iranians were using that ship to provide the Houthis with information. And remember, this isn't the first time the Houthis struck into the Red Sea. It was 2016. As a matter of fact, I was there at the time when they struck into the Red Sea and were blowing up ships. They were claiming they were only attacking at that time the UAE or Saudi folks that were involved. Forces that were involved in the conflict in Yemen at the time. That wasn't true, because we had U.S. ships attack during that time and responded rather robustly then. So we know that we know from that and previous times that ship does supply the Houthis with intelligence and information, and especially you can think about it this way: it could be telling them what ships are heading, which ones are the ones maybe you should target, which ones they aren't. Now they moved that ship around, as I understand it. It moved south into the Gulf of Aden, not too long ago. And by the way, as soon as it moved into the Gulf of Aden, that's when we saw the strikes begin in the Gulf of Aden. And the Gulf of Aden is the area south of Yemen, as opposed to the Red Sea, which is west of Yemen. So if you want a direct tie into whether it's feeding information to Yemenis, just go look at the coincidence of attacks in the Red Sea, and then when they started in the Gulf of Aden was when that ship moved its position down to the Gulf of Aden. It's an Iranian ship, but it's not, it's a converted commercial ship of some kind that they use, but they outfit it with the intelligence gathering apparatus.
Is there a way, though, I think the viewer's asking, to sort of remove that capability, that intel capability, that you think the U.S. should consider?
I would
Uh,
communicate privately, issue an ultimatum first before we actually do that, and then see what the Iranian response is. Make it very clear that, we see an actual connection, present to them evidence, expose them, and then see what the Iranian response is. If there's no response whatsoever, I think all options should be on the table. Absolutely.
Hmm. The
Yeah.
other question, oh, I'm so sorry.
No, Nancy, I agree with Bilal. Absolutely, it should be on the table. It's a function of when you would go to that option and how you would mechanize anything related to that, as Bilal said.
The other question that I saw that I thought was quite interesting was what other Arab nations are doing. Egypt, for example, is impacted quite significantly economically, given the inability of ships to go up to the Suez Canal. I was wondering if you could give our viewers some sense of what role Arab states have in sort of addressing this problem, and what the U.S. could do to better engage with the region that is also deeply divided about the U.S. Support of the war in Gaza.
Bilal, why don't I take Egypt and you can take the Gulf.
I was
Gulf.
going to say that exactly. Go ahead.
So from an Egypt standpoint, as you can imagine, in my previous roles, very strong relationships with Egypt, because the Suez Canal used to be and remains a centerpiece of what we all want to have traffic flow through. Because the reason the Red Sea is causing the impact it is because it's the only way to get to the Suez Canal. So if you effectively choke off traffic through the Red Sea, you've basically choked off the Suez Canal. The key element for Egypt is they're in a tough dilemma. They're obviously sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but also directly impacted by any refugees that would, they could potentially come to Egypt from that. Directly impacted by the huge economic impact of not having the revenue from the Suez Canal. So they're caught in the pocketbook very, very hard. And at a time that they're already having issues, because the war in Ukraine, Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world. And there's only two places they really get their wheat from, the Ukraine and Russia. So if you can imagine now, with despite the agreements that we made and all that, there's been an impact on the flow of that wheat for the Egyptians. So to Egypt, which they need for their country. And now, when you're choking off at the same time the money that they need to fuel, the basic needs and economy, it's a double whammy for them. But they're caught in a very tough position, because to now in any way look like you're supporting the West here or supporting anything related to Israel, or it's difficult for them from the standpoint of their population, it is sympathetic. So it becomes very, very difficult for them. They would want absolutely the Suez Canal back open, but they can't actually partner at this time to the level that they probably should, because of the impact it's having on their economy. So they're in a tough position. They really want this resolved. And so I view them as essential in terms of pressure and coalition building, but don't expect them to be their front pages. I would want that, I would expect them to hopefully use all of their throw weight to put pressure on Iran and other nations to help get at stopping the resupply effort. But don't expect them to directly support it, is my sense. Bilal, you want to talk about some of the other Arab nations?
Yeah, the Gulf states are not going to contribute kinetically or in terms of firepower, for understandable reasons that we discussed earlier. But there are other contributions that they can make that could be equally significant. Obviously, the issue of intelligence, staff support, and then just financial contributions. They're incredibly important to what NAFCENT is trying to do at sea with its Task Force 59, right? If they can buy or finance more of these unmanned vessels that NAFCENT is putting at sea in order to enhance its maritime domain awareness, because it's a large swath of territory, right? You need as many of those as possible. Then those could be incredibly important contributions. This has to be a collective effort. We cannot do this on our own, and there are very significant ways that these Arab partners can contribute without having to fly fighter jets and bomb targets. Absolutely.
You've talked about the region. I wonder if you could expand the question, if we could expand it to Europe. because given the economic impact on them, are there options militarily or diplomatically that haven't been fully exercised by Europe?
Well, they have their own independent task force, right? That is separate from Prosperity Guardian. But I mean, Kevin can tell you about the challenges of having to work with the Europeans. I understand that obviously it's a collective good that we all want to protect, but you know, the Europeans have different threat assessments when it comes to Iran and different concerns about escalation. And so I understand why they do that, but it can be very much frustrating, obviously, for the United States. But Kevin could give you more details about his own experience about, you know, working with the Europeans.
That's a question that you're looking for an answer that maybe it's hard to work with the Europeans. I'd say I don't mind at all that the Europeans have a separate operation because anytime they have in the past when we were doing counter piracy, when we were doing other things, there were other EU and European task forces that would come down doing similar things. And every time they did, we could work out an agreement and common cause and deconfliction and sharing of information so that we could get it's more assets to get at the problem set. So I didn't worry about that. They may come with additional constraints on what they can and can't do, but that's why Admiral Wyckoff, who's in Fifth Fleet now, can work through those. Before it was Brad Cooper, works through a mechanism where those two task forces can still meet the taskings and missions they're given from above, but also collectively, there's probably some information sharing and things that can be done between the two to make them more effective together. So I don't look at that as a negative. I was never a believer in you needed one organization to be most effective. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Each nation contributes the way they can, and if we can get more people contributing because we have a separate group there doing a similar thing, then that's a win across the board.
Okay, but I take your point. What I also hear you say though is so far in the offensive strikes that we've seen, it's only been the UK to provide military support. It sounds like you don't see a scenario where they either could do that on their own, or you could have other European nations providing fighter jets, ships, other.
So in terms of providing the direct assets, you're correct, I think. I'm not really sure exactly who else may be participating. But we do have other nations that are supporting via staff members and intelligence and other things these strikes. So it's not just those two nations that are the only ones supporting the strikes. It's a smaller group than Prosperity Guardian that's doing it. But if you go back originally, remember there were kind of Prosperity and Guardian started. We then had the ultimatum issued in January from 14 nations saying stop or else, right? And then we had the attacks, which is a smaller group still that are able to participate in that. But what that shows you is there is a larger group of nations that see this as a concern, and those are the ones that Bilal's arguing for that can be involved in the pressure on Iran to do this resupply and on others that can influence Iran. Remember, we all know that the way that you influence isn't just directly. It's all means, economically, trade, etc. It's other groups. There's ways that they can participate. So I think in the end there are much more nations than just the ones that are doing the kinetic piece that'll have an impact on the success or failure of what we're talking about. We need to do here.
Give some credit to the Dutch. Sorry, Nancy.
Yep.
Give some credit to the Dutch. They're providing some staff support, but also some symbolic military contributions, and also politically, obviously.
I'd love to end our conversation with it. If you could kind of help our viewers, you're in charge of policy for a day. To help me understand, I'll use a pie chart as sort of the, if it works for you, how much of that pie chart is interdiction? How much of it is offensive strikes? How much of it is defensive strikes? If you could craft the policy, how would that balance come together to, in your mind, lead to the most effective countermeasures against the threat in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden?
Go ahead, Kevin. I'm not going to touch that. It's very difficult.
I don't know that I would draw any, how when you put a pie chart together, you draw the lines on which one's bigger or smaller. initially you may not have a choice on whether you can make one bigger or smaller, right? What you want to define are the things that, like you just did very clearly, that should be contributing. And based on the situation, you try to use all the elements that we have and that the other nations have to impact what you're trying to achieve. So in something like this, I would see those things as ebbing and flowing based on where we have contributions, where we can gain traction, and where we can't. You mentioned interdiction. You mentioned political. There's a whole economic piece. There's a whole piece related to I won't call them sanctions, but all countries have agreements to do things amongst each other. Those things can be brought to bear. We have a whole Treasury department that can really start to get at even more greatly financing. You're seeing that across the spectrum, right? And by financing, there are companies here that are helping get things into Yemen that shouldn't be, that are unrelated to Iran, because maybe it's profit. I don't know what drives them. Maybe it's illicit. Maybe Iran has asked them to do it. I don't know. But there's ways that those groups can be approached, and the U.S. can't do that alone. Their Treasury Department, they do it in partner with other nations as long as they're willing to do it. And what Bilal said earlier on is there are enough UN sanctions, Security Council resolutions to give weight behind it that we can get at. So back to your pie chart, I would put everything that I can bring to bear on the pie chart, and then those things are going to be. You're going to prioritize which ones you'd like to have grow more, but you may not have an option to grow it, and you're going to hope that in the end you'd love it for it to be resolved without with less military intervention, and have the other pieces carry greater weight, so that the interdiction efforts that you're talking about, like what happened on the ship, become not the norm to stop it. They become a component, but not the main component.
Bilal, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I mean, the interdiction effort is, as we discussed, much more proactive, preventive. But then the offensive strikes are, I mean, whether we like it or not, they're frankly more reactive than anything else, right? Anytime you're going to see a strike from the Houthis, we're going to go after that target. We're going to go after that location, right? So I don't think this administration is going to actually launch a campaign to really go after as many targets as possible. I think we're going to be much more reactive in that case. So what we're trying to say here in this paper is that we need to complement that, because one is complementary of the other. We need to complement that with something at sea that interdicts their supply lines in order to degrade those capabilities. I had someone in my office just yesterday telling me, off the record, that he would be shocked, current State Department official, he would be shocked if the administration were to actually be on board with even the word campaign, actually, a campaign in Yemen today that will be fully resourced in terms of offensive, right, approach. Perhaps there might be some kind of an appetite for an interdiction regime, even though he was also skeptical about that, but no usage whatsoever of the term of offensive campaign in Yemen, given the difficult history that the United States has had in that part of the world.
And I imagine too, because of just the suffering that is happening for everyday Yemeni people, the idea of
absolutely
being aggressive.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for such an engaging conversation. And I also want to thank our viewers who asked so many thoughtful questions. The Middle East Institute has some very, very smart viewers of their panels. I'm sorry we didn't get all of them, but I want to thank you both. I think we covered such a wide span of topics, and I hope that viewers got a more fulsome understanding of some of the complexities of the problem in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and some things to think about how to tackle these very, very challenging problems.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much for everybody who logged in.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.